Welcome to the In-Betwixt and In-Between. This is Leadership Limbo, a podcast aimed at helping leaders embrace the discomfort and power of leading themselves and others in the midst of it all. We blend real insights with practical tools to help you lead with self-awareness, purpose, and influence wherever you are on your leadership journey. John, it's great to see you again.
Buddy, how you doing today? Good to see you.
Good. It's good to be back together. Excited that we're doing this 1 week after the last. And so, getting some momentum here. But we're excited to join with all of you today, and to our listeners who started with us just this past week. Thank you so much for joining us on our first podcast and for all the feedback that you have shared so far, whether it be via text or on LinkedIn or even messages on the platform itself. We really do appreciate the feedback you share and want to be really interactive with all of you. So welcome back this week. And today we're going to take this down another level from where we started last week, where we framed kind of the big picture concept of what liminality means and liminal leadership means. And I want to present three paradigms. We're not going to talk about all three today, but the three paradigms that better help us to define the middle might be as follows. The first paradigm is the very, I think, concrete form of middle management. So you are in the middle, literally in the org chart. You have a manager or leaders above you, and you have people who you manage, possibly even leaders, quote unquote, below you. That's the first paradigm. The second paradigm that we will get to over the course of this podcast is the concept of more middle career. So the idea of not necessarily like in the middle years of your life, but you might be in career transition and thinking about how to navigate where you stand as a leader in the midst of transition. And the third paradigm is a little bit more abstract, a little bit more ethereal, but also, I would argue, very important, which is the concept of being in the middle between the people you are leading and yourself, and the internal and interior work you need to do as a leader to be effective. Over the course of the next few podcasts, John and I are excited to really dive into that first paradigm. It's probably the most pragmatic. It's most likely the most real in terms of lived experiences of those who've tuned into this podcast, in terms of I am a manager and what you're sharing is very much my reality. We hope it is, at least. And so I'm going to turn it over to John here in just a moment. We just also wanted to flag one other term that I think is really important, and that is the concept of leader and manager. And we talked about this the other day, is that in our conception, we believe that leadership and management are not separate. That if you are a manager, you are expected to lead, whether by a formal decree of your company or simply by the expectations of the people who you manage. That you need to be showing up as a leader, and not only as the quote-unquote traditional view of management might be viewed as paper pushing, signing off on timesheets, managing PTO. That is also part of management, but we would like to challenge all of us, including our listeners, to think of management beyond simply a limited term and think of management as a form of leadership. John, anything you want to add to that before we dive into the next part?
No, I mean, I think hitting on that last term, there is something that we might have very different views than I think how some people see manager. I see it as a life-giving term if done well. Others, I think, always you'll see these things on social media that are manager versus leader, and the leader's inspirational and empowering others, and the manager's just the person that checks on your status and gets your PTO confirmed and tries to hold you down. And that's not, I don't think that's true. And so I'm excited to get into that. But really, while it's practical and pragmatic, I think anyone that's new to leadership knows that this first structure, this first kind of focus we have, which is on middle management itself and that structure and where you fit essentially in an org chart, is actually more complex than just like an org chart. And so, with that, I'm gonna take it from there to kind of lay out some common challenges. And I hesitate to frame these as challenges because I think when we think about middle level leadership, and whether you're new to it or you've been in it for a few years or you've had it for many years, I think many people can see middle level leadership as this real life-giving opportunity, right? It really presents this incredible opportunity to carry out a vision for someone an organization or a particular leader that you feel compelled by. and you get to share that with others and really develop them and bring them along without maybe the weight of that number one. And so there's a lot of positives to it. So I hope I framed this in kind of that way. The first one, really want to talk about the first layer. So we're going to kind of talk about layers of where the challenges occur, is on this idea of managing and leading others. Okay. And so this is, in my context, this took place first for me when I'd been a teacher for a while. Had, I think, gotten pretty skilled at that, maybe had done some teacher leadership opportunities, but now I had moved into a formal a formal position of leadership, right? And I was defined as that. And my first job was as what was titled as an associate director. For many people, that is pretty common. I was a great engineer. It was, one of the top performers on my team, really skilled at the work of this. And then the promotion made sense for me to move into a position of leadership or management. And now I'm managing others because of that skill set that I had showcased. You can think of your industry, and that's the case. And so that's a great opportunity. It's obviously a sign that people believe in you to have you grow and lead others, but it can lead to a host of challenges or opportunities that, if not kind of addressed or thought about, can become problematic. And so what are some of those? Well, I think the first one is always this idea of you move into that and you have to build influence or kind of establish credibility in a different way. So number one is, how do you build influence or establish credibility? And so that, again, when you are a person who's been really skilled at something, others may have known that or seen it, especially if you came within the organization and kind of moved up into that position. But now they're going to be like, well, now you're telling me to do it, and I know that I did it just as well as you when you were in this position. And so you've got to think about building credibility in a very different way than maybe when you were, on the same level as others.
Yeah, and just to add,
go on.
Sorry, just to react to that one too, John. I think that's one of the most common challenges that a new leader will face, and we'll dive into that more in future episodes. But I think that it goes back to where we started with last week, which was the idea that your title alone is not going to get you the ability to truly make impact on people. It might get you the ability to hold people a little bit more accountable, at least by more traditional power, but it's not going to create the influence you need. And you might have a leg up because you've started with John, you were a great teacher, and John was a great teacher, still is a great teacher. And so you do get people who see that and say, yeah, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt because you were a great engineer or salesperson or marketer. But very quickly, as you've kind of alluded to, that almost dissipates and says, well, but you're wearing a new hat, and that new hat requires something different of you. So I just wanted to add to that.
Yeah, and it kind of flows into the next challenge that people often feel when now they're managing others is there's a shift in the relationship type.
Right.
I mean, that just naturally is going to occur. Sometimes it doesn't happen right away. You may have gained so much credibility by being part of a team that when you move into a position of leadership, that people initially they kind of say, oh, this is great. They kind of know what we're dealing with. This person can help us with it. But pretty quickly, when you realize as a leader that you have to take a different approach or hold people accountable to certain things or kind of do what we're going to talk about in a minute, which is manage through others, that can change pretty quickly.
Yeah. Happy hours start to look a little different.
They do, right? So those shift in relationships and how you respond or kind of work with folks is going to look different. We hope that those relationships are positive. And I think that's where people often have a difficult problem is they do become, well, I got to be more stalwart and kind of mean and authoritarian because now I'm the boss. No, you don't have to do that. Like, you can be very life-giving as a manager. A lot of statistics that managers have as big of an impact on people and how they feel about themselves other than maybe their spouse or their partner, right? And that also is not like, you're not going to be their buddy in the same way anymore, right? And so shift of relationship is one. When you're in this position and you're working and you're managing people, they might be looking to you for some sort of decision or authority, or if there's something they don't like, they blame you. And you were wrestling with the fact that I actually have a pretty limit. There's a limit to my authority here. I am actually working through this other person who is my boss or the vision of the company. I'd perhaps believe in it. Maybe if it were up to me, I'd do it differently, but this is what we're dealing with. But you also just can't sit there if you're going to be a good leader and tell people, hey, this isn't my fault, it's them. I don't want to do it, I just have to. That's poor leadership, right? And we're going to get to that later. But you are wrestling with that where you deeply know this isn't all about me. I'm the one executing a vision for others. Some people don't like it, and you have to learn how to kind of handle that, right? And that comes to now you're working about getting outcomes through others as well. That's a really beautiful thing.
That's it. Yeah.
That's the thing, man. When you can learn how to inspire and get others to do the things that maybe you were good at and you get them to do it well, but maybe even help them to learn their way of doing it that's different than yours. I think there's nothing more beautiful about leadership, and especially mid-level leadership, than that. Right. I think mid-level leaders that's a thing that when an organization's set up well, that's what they're charged with doing, that maybe the top person isn't worrying about as much, right? Quite frankly, because they're setting vision 5 or 10 years down the road. And that's very challenging, especially early on, because you might be inclined to say, well, I'm here because I was a great individual contributor and I did things well. And this is where micromanagement becomes a problem. Right, Josh? Like, this is where you just say, well, I'll just take over and do this because I know I can do it better than anyone else and I'll get there. I'll tell you, you do that once, it seems okay. But when you find yourself doing that 5 or 6 years down the road, you've probably had a lot of people leave your team by that time too, because they're like, well, this person doesn't want me to do anything. Or the minute that you try to get them to do something, their feeling is, well, you've never allowed me to do something before, or you don't like the way I do it. So why would I work for you? So man, getting the outcomes through others, I think, is the greatest opportunity, but the biggest challenge, especially when maybe you were promoted because you had a particular skill set that made you better on it, which leads to that last one, is this idea of managing your perception, right? Managing your perception, being attuned to how others truly see you, and you have to be responsible for this. And I think that is both, how do they feel about you as their boss or leader or their manager? Do they feel empowered by you? Do they feel that you're clear and bringing clarity to what you want from them? But also, are you representing your boss and the company that you work for, the organization you work for, in the right light? You know, you have to, if you're having tension with the ultimate vision, then you're going to be perceived as someone of like, oh, he doesn't really care about the organization. He or she doesn't believe in what they're doing. And people might like that, but it's also going to draw a large disconnect between the whole org. So those are, 5 kind of different threads that can be challenging there. There's more when it comes to managing or leading others. Josh, other responses or just other takeaways from that section before we move on to the next?
No, I think that's a really great overview. And as mentioned earlier, what we hope to do with that is really dive into each of those over the course of the next several months. One thing really came to mind as you were talking about that, and a couple of terms are popping up in my mind. One is to that point about getting outcomes through others really requires a huge shift in terms of kind of your North Star. And for a while as an individual contributor, that North Star was pretty much what you've done. And all of a sudden it shifts to, are you fighting for others to reach that pinnacle as well? Are you fighting for the highest good of others? And I think starting to recalibrate what your true purpose is really to unlock the potential of others. And that becomes, I think, what a lot of people get into work because they are altruistic. I think many people do want to see others succeed, but it's one thing to write that on paper and say, that's what I believe. And it's another thing to sit in a meeting as a manager with a person who reports to you and have to actually live that out in that moment. So it really does require that posture shift towards thinking about fighting for the highest good of others. And again, I think that's in many of our hearts, but it's a skill set to actually be able to do that.
Yep. Agreed. Yeah, fully.
Awesome.
Take us into the next layer of this chapter.
Yeah, cool. So I think the second focus in kind of the space of opportunities is what it's like to be managed as a leader. Yeah. And again, if you've come from,
I want to stamp that. Yeah. Because others think, well, like at any level you're being managed. But when you've made this shift, and if you haven't made this shift, you won't know this, but when you've made the shift to now you're the leader and you're in charge of someone and you're still being managed, but you're being managed. I just want to stamp what Josh said there. Being managed as a leader feels very different than when I'm an individual contributor who has a very specific, frame that I am working on when it comes to working within my org, and I am doing this part of the project or whatever it might be, is different than when I am now titled as a leader and I'm being managed. So Josh, I'll let you take it away, but I just want to really hit that. I think that's key what you said there.
Yeah, I think it's really good to sit on that for a moment. And everyone who's listening should ask themselves, oh yeah, has that been a thing that I didn't even honor as a reality? So a couple of challenge opportunities that live in this space. And I'll be clear, like these are challenges, but we do want to frame these as opportunities to lean into, to grow from, and to become a more impactful, more influential leader as a result. So we do think of these as opportunities. I think one of the opportunity spaces is what does it look like to carry out somebody else's vision? Maybe you've contributed to it. Maybe you're new to a huge company and you have no input in that vision. What does it look like to carry out somebody else's vision through other people? Not simply like, oh, I heard their vision, that's fine with me, I'm going to go do it myself. But you, to John's previous point, are responsible for carrying out your leader's or your manager's vision. or their manager's vision.
Well, and the transition of understanding and knowing that vision, internalizing it for yourself, and then quickly having to build others a belief in that and capacity to execute based on that vision is a bigger transition than when it's just, I'm not managing others. So it's just me figuring it out for myself. And how do I connect to this? And do I believe in it?
Right.
That like quick transition to that, we just talked about leading others, but that movement from the vision of the company or the leader above you to setting and wrestling with myself about it to getting others to believe in it is complex.
Yeah, we've sat in that seat of saying, this sounds fine. And then now I'm sitting across from a person I manage who asks me the question of like, whose idea was this?
Yeah.
Or what does that really mean? And you all of a sudden recognize, even if I have disagreements, if I choose to kind of throw the institution, the organization, the mission of whatever we're doing under the bus to kind of preserve my own opinion with this person, that ripple effect is dramatic. And how to manage yourself.
One of the most damning things you can do as a leader. I mean, in the short term, it might sound fine. You might feel like you'll build credibility with your constituents, the people that you manage. Long term, it's not going to help anyone.
That's right.
So, yeah.
That's right. I think another factor to kind of consider as an opportunity, but a reality, is the weight that you feel as a leader with your manager, because both of you are responsible for potentially dozens of people within the company, bigger outcomes. And so there is a higher degree of stress, of pressure, and of weight that exists in that dynamic than might exist with you coaching another person who you manage, who might just be, I don't want to ever say just be an individual contributor, but who might not have the responsibility of managing 7 or 8 or 10, 15 people themselves. So when you put yourself in that room with a manager who is, you're one of their direct reports, who's carrying perhaps major financial obligations and responsibilities for a company or outcomes for student success, there is a lot of tension and stress that might exist in that space. So how do you figure out how to show up effectively? It's a big opportunity space. Yep. I think another one, the responsibility of showing results that ultimately others have needed to accomplish and not you directly.
Huge.
We know the pressure of that, and it's real.
Yep. Yeah, no, I just see a huge difference. If you haven't experienced, and I assume a lot of people here have, is if your main goal in this position is to get results, but all of a sudden it's not just through my own personal drive of completing a project or doing my part of a project, but I got to get others to do it. Again, one of the most beautiful things about this level of leadership, but that's very difficult as well.
It's difficult for sure. Mm-hmm. And you can't show up and say, well, they didn't do their job, because your job is to help them be able to do their job.
Yep.
I think there's another piece here. We'll get to this in a future episode as well, but the importance of managing a narrative and being able to recognize that your boss might only have, 10% of their week devoted to understanding anything that you're responsible for. And that 10% is all of a sudden focused into that 30-minute weekly check-in.
If you're
10, yeah, right. That's right. And your window into helping them to better understand the state of the union, to better understand the state of your org is a premium. Your words matter, your time and their time matters. And I think even for me, a big shift I recognize moving from a nonprofit space to a for-profit space is when they say that time is money, it is literally the way that money and time is measured in a corporation, is how much time is this meeting? Well, we had 10 executives in that meeting. That was a $5,000 meeting for 45 minutes and we did nothing with it. So when you start to realize that time is money, depending on your context, you also realize that it's really critical to be able to bring forward a narrative that is both with integrity and of importance to that space. And then the last one we'll get to, and I think these will be some really interesting conversations. This is all premised under a certain degree of healthfulness in an organization where there's a healthy relationship with you and your boss and your managers, and hopefully with the people you report or who report to you. But we also know that there's oftentimes, unfortunately, toxicity in a workplace environment, and sometimes toxicity with your own manager. Sure. So what happens when you have a toxic manager? You might be listening to this and saying, well, gosh, this stuff all sounds great if I could even get a word in edgewise with my manager, but they don't care to listen. They don't care to change the culture. Those realities do exist, but I would also challenge all of us to think that perhaps a reframing of toxicity is helpful, because otherwise we kind of externalize it. We leave it as a festering problem and do nothing with it. So we will get to those down the road as well. So John, any reactions to that before we kind of move into our last segment?
I think this fits on the last one there. I think that I don't want to get too much into like, what do you do with a toxic boss or a toxic situation? I think we'll talk on that at some point. Mm-hmm. I will say this. I think one thing that wraps all of this is as you move higher, and especially as your boss has much more at whatever level they're at, whether you're actually being managed by the number one in your org or just someone who sits on the C-suite or someone who's like a VP level, the higher you go, I think the easier it becomes to actually begin to say, well, you're close enough to the decision rights that I don't have a lot of empathy for you, or you make enough money that this shouldn't be an issue. And I think that's really problematic. And so I think that one of the main things that's really good middle level leaders do is they humanize the people above them. I mean, because you want people below you who are, I say below and above, that sounds too hierarchical, but like who you manage to understand that you're dealing with certain realities and that there's nuance and difficulty to what you're doing. You got to give that to your boss too. Yeah. I mean, you got to think through what they're dealing with, because there's often things that they're dealing with that you just don't know about because you haven't been at that level. So just something to leave us with there. Last one here. I think the third kind of layer to this is when you get into leadership. And I think each step in leadership or each step in your career leads to a shift in identity, and how you manage the new identity that you've embraced. And I think the sooner that new leaders begin to be aware of this and tackle it, the better. I think when I first became a leader, I said, oh, this will not change who I am and how I act in the workplace. And, I might have said things that, oh, I'm going to advocate for you on X, Y, and Z because I know you and I as partners these last few years have complained about X, Y, and Z. But that's just not going to match after a few months. You're going to say, oh, my workday looks different. I now realize certain things that are barriers to this of why we can't do it that way. And that begins to shift of, wait, am I changing? Is there something, what's it doing to me? Do I like this? How are others going to respond when they see this shift in me? And that's really key. We've talked about this a few times, but there's a big shift when you go from an individual contributor that you have a very specific role on a team. Your job may really just be not just, but to execute well on something. Right. To now I will not be successful in this role if I just rely on my content expertise. If you are so in love with your content expertise and that's what you want to do, I think that's beautiful. You need to stick with the role you did before because management's completely different. And having that knowledge is important, but it's, again, like we said, it's getting others. It's about shifting success from it's me doing it to I get a team to do this well is much more important. And that's a big identity shifter. I'm managing folks. That means I have to be different with these people. It means I have to think differently about my work is critical. And the last thing that we'll talk about here, which is where we're going with this, is we really believe in the idea of tackling what does it mean to me, to my organization at some level, and to others to be a manager. And we somewhat loosely, like society does, interchange between manager and leader. We think there's a lot of power in being a great manager. And we think there's a lot of skills that go in with actually being a great manager. I think in future episodes, we'll do our best to differentiate between how Josh and I talk about like a leader, like the leader of an org, and maybe you as a manager. Or if you might have to switch hats between when I'm the leader, but when I'm the manager, because I think those are critical. And that's where we're going next. I think I won't get too much into that, but really want you to maybe do some thinking before our next episode to you, what does it mean to be a manager? Is that an icky word for you? Do you dislike that word and you'd rather be a leader? Or do you think about it differently and understand the qualities of a good manager and how that might look different than being, the visionary leader, I guess I would say. So going to leave it there. Josh is going to, thoughts to wrap that section, but then I know Josh is going to get us into a little bit of the prompting for, outside of this episode.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, I think just on that last point, we want to keep coming back to that tension of leadership, management, different, same. Where's the Venn diagram? Where's it overlap? And our encouragement is that this podcast at large is truly about leadership, right? It's about leadership, whether you're leading with title, leading without, leading yourself, leading others. And so this prompt here, I think, will hopefully help center some of that focus in terms of an exercise that helps. So we'll call it a 3, 2, 1. And we would encourage you to take some time to jot this down in your journal, or just as you're listening to this, think about this momentarily and come back to it. But for 3, we'd like for you to think about 3 of your biggest successes or 3 of the ways in which you are currently leading. And I'm explicitly using the term leading as opposed to the term managing. Where are you leading in your current role with some success? 2 of the biggest opportunity spaces could be viewed in your mind as a challenge, but 2 of the biggest challenges that are opportunities in your current work in management or leadership or wherever you might be positioned. And then 1 action you could take next week to get some traction towards solving or working towards solving one of those opportunities. So we leave you with that as a prompt to generate some thinking. Yep. 3 successes in leadership, 2 opportunities in leadership, and 1 way in which to act on that.
Yeah, and use the 3 layers that we talked about to define, well, where in those layers am I fitting in terms of where my challenges are, right? So go back to the discussion we had here and try to fit it into that. So, with that said, Josh and I just want to thank everyone who's listening and taking part in this. Please, subscribe to this. Give it a 5-star rating if you like it. Leave some comments. We love to read those and kind of learn from folks. Message us, whatever it might be, to let us know what you like about this, but where you hope it goes. We're new to this and can be nimble and want to change it up. So until next time, this has been Liminal Leadership, where we make space for the tension and the tools for the journey. Again, hit subscribe, share with your friends, and we'll see you in the in-between.